Today on Rates and Barrels, we discuss a wild opening weekend around baseball and another extension for the Cubs. Let's go. Welcome to Rates and Barrels to Monday, March 30th. Derek Van Riper here with Eno Saris. The ABS system is here, Eno, and it worked great in the opening weekend. It might have even been the star of the show in a few instances around the league.
The crowd went wild. I think the crowd really loved it. In Toronto, Alejandro Kirk got a strike three to finish off the side for Dylan Cease, and the crowd went wild. There's a audience participation aspect to it, not only in the waiting for the strike call to come through on the screen, but also in the showing up the ump. CB Buckner had a bad day in Cincinnati where he was out there. He got 6 calls overturned by the Reds, who, remember, we pointed this out, the Reds were the best team at ABS in the spring run up to this. And so the Reds got 6 calls overturned by CB Buckner, including 2 consecutive strike threes against Eugenio Suarez. The crowd really loved those moments.
I think we love it when the umpires being wrong gets fixed. I think that's something that we all underestimated when ABS was implemented going into this season. Mike Petriello had some data on Monday morning. Overall, 54% of challenges have resulted in calls being overturned. From the hitters challenging, only 42% have been overturned. It's the defense, it's mostly the catchers that are doing really well with this. 63% of challenges initiated from fielders have actually been overturned so far. And I do think that's where we're going to see the bulk of the success, the edges on the margins, if you will. I think it's going to come from catchers knowing the zone extremely well. And it's not surprising. Their perspective of the strike zone is better than the perspective that any umpire could actually have being in a position behind them.
Yeah, I think there are still some possible secondary effects that the league may think they understand what's coming and they may not have it completely sussed out. The reason I say this is strikeouts and walks right now in the early going are up really big, even if you look at April to April. Now, it's not just April to April, though, because really the back ends of rotations haven't gone as far, right? Like, we've really only seen the front end of rotation. So that may be all that's happening. But there may be secondary effects when you look at the fact that, hey, the catchers are so much better at this than the hitters. What's going to happen when you continue to dial it in? That means you're going to create more extra strikes than you're going to create extra balls, right? Just thinking of like why a hitter would challenge, what he wants if he's good at it, and why the catcher would challenge. So this may end up suppressing offense a little bit. Of course, the general thing could be we're going towards full ABS. The other thing that you can do once you kind of dial in the science of having the robots on board is that you can change the strike zone. You can be very specific and scientific about changing the strike zone as opposed to saying to the umpires, oh, this or oh, that. You can say, this is how the robots they're going to shave an inch off here. They're going to shave an inch off here. So there is a potential for them to be really intentional about how to implement strike zone changes, but there's also this possibility of secondary effects. And why would they tested this in minor leagues? Why would it be different than major leagues? Hey, major league framers are better. Major league catchers are better. The best catchers in baseball are in the major leagues, and they might be able to take this to another level, especially if they're given autonomy. If you have a great framing catcher who the team says, hey, if you think it's right, go for it, and they give you that aggressive thing, then you might be able to dial in a bunch of strikes. I know there was a discussion in the Discord about, should you be able to hold on to your challenge if you're correct, right? And I actually, in the context of what we're talking about right now, I get that, because if you can be really aggressive and you have a very good framing catcher who has a very good sense of the zone, you could get a lot of strikes. I mean, 6 strikes off of CB Buckner, right? Like, you could be very aggressive. Another thing I saw that was interesting in the breakdown is that the older umpires are worse at this than the younger umpires. The younger umpires have come through the age of technology, have been trained by this technology. They know what they're doing in terms of the interaction with the technology. The older guys may get pushed out by this. You know, if it's going to be really obvious that CB Buckner is getting overturned all the time, you know, it's fun for the crowd, but at some point, Major League Baseball is going to have to say, is this the best umpire that we can put out there right now?
Yeah, and Johnny Flores Jr. had a pretty detailed breakdown from the opening weekend of the catchers and how they fared. Actually, all the fielders were included in there, but the umpires with the lowest overturn rate were 3 that actually were challenged on 3 or more occasions that had 0 calls overturned. So give Bruce Dreckman, Will Little, and David Rackley some opening weekend flowers for that. But Chris Siegel had 10 challenges against him, and 7 of those were overturned. Chad Whitson, 7 challenges, 7 overturned. So it wasn't even just CB. It was a lot of umpires getting, pushed around a little bit by the players in the opening weekend. And maybe over the course of the year, it'll tighten up a little bit, right? There's always that possibility for adjustments as well.
I do think these numbers are meaningful, by the way, because if you look at, we haven't tested like umpire wrong call percentage stability. Like, what I'm saying is that we haven't tested umpires to see like, oh, is this a meaningful sample of umpire calls to know how good or bad they are? And I would say that we have, in a way, tested this before, because we know how quickly batters start to stabilize in terms of how often they swing at balls outside the zone. Isn't that the same skill? Like, they're assessing balls and strikes. And we know that batters stabilize at about 100 plate appearances. Well, that sounds like a lot, but 100 plate appearances is about 350 to 400 pitches. An umpire sees 350 to 400 pitches in a game. So it might just take 2 games for you to understand how good an umpire is at what they're doing, really. Which is kind of amazing to say.
Yeah, and you could go from having a zone that's too big to having a zone that's too small. The challenges that are getting overturned against you might be going the other direction eventually, too. There's a lot of different ways this could
how do you make that adjustment as an umpire? Do you adjust too hard, or it's almost like being a player, right? Do you adjust, or do you say, no, this process is what got me here to the big leagues?
Yeah.
I'm going to trust the process.
There was a player-specific story that Brendan Cuddy wrote about Aaron Judge, because Judge used ABS to overturn a call and then later homer in the same at-bat. It was a low-called strike, which happens to him a lot. Big player, big zone. And if you think about it, something that could make Aaron Judge even better, like taking away calls that were going against him, only boost that offensive profile more if that ends up, I don't know, leading to maybe, let's just say, even a dozen different situations where he takes an at-bat, extends it, and gets on base or does damage.
And he, in particular, has had strike zone issues against, like, in terms of, he has been called incorrectly a lot because of just how tall he is. Because you know, if you're an umpire, you're in, behind the catcher, you're trying to look down at the bottom of the zone, and you're seeing this big guy. So, like, a pitch that is not a strike for him would still be high off the ground. So if you're just using the ground as a relative point, he ends up getting a lot of low called strikes that are balls. That's a fact. And so, yeah, if he can turn that around. I also wanted to point out there is some subjectivity in this. We found this actually with the pitch clock too. The pitch clock sounds very much like, oh, there's this amount of time and that's it, right? Like, oh, that must be really scientific. But when do you start the clock? Like, we ended up, like, there were times when umpires would like, oh, they're celebrating a homer, we're not going to start the clock right away, right? So there are some touch and feel, and the same is true when it comes to ABS, because in our first ejection, we had an ejection, and Kevin Brown on the call rightly said, you can't argue with the machines. However, the argument that they made in the game was the Orioles against the Twins. Derek Shelton got ejected for arguing. It wasn't necessarily the call. It was the fact that Josh Bell was already halfway down to first, but before he found out that they were doing the ABS challenge. So I think Derek Shelton, I don't know if it's rightly, because I don't know. I'm just saying there is an amount of subjectivity when it comes to, did they call it quick enough? Did they hit the helmet quick enough? And so we are going to still have some arguments. If people were worried that arguments would go away, I present to you a long history of baseball fandom to say, I don't think the arguments are ever going away.
Yeah, I don't know if we're going to have the equivalent of the shot clock lights in basketball, where there's like a 3-second clock that goes off after the pitch happens. And if the contact is not made hand to head before the lights in the stadium go on, yeah. I don't think it's going to come down to that. The call that Shelton ended up getting ejected for, I actually thought Helsley did touch his hat in a reasonable amount of time. I don't know. This is the I'll know it when I see it sort of call, but I didn't think there was an actual egregious delayed challenge there. We've seen players making their way down the first baseline already in a few different instances and having calls overturned where they had to come back. So I'm not using that as my litmus test.
My favorite ABS call of the weekend, though, actually, and this is surprising given that Eugenio Suarez overturned 2 straight strike threes against C.B. Buckner. My very favorite was Randy Arozarena struck out, tapped his helmet, and took all the stuff off on the way to first base like he knew he was going to win it. And it was just the utter confidence. I mean, Randy Arozarena does everything with confidence, but so it's not surprising he does ABS challenges with confidence. But I just love the supreme confidence and the showmanship. I mean, this has been really my big takeaway from the weekend is that fans love to show up umpires, and that this is tapping into their ability to finally tell that umpire in real time that he was wrong.
Yeah. I think we all have some joy when the authority figures are shown to be wrong, and we all get to celebrate it together. But thumbs up from me so far, and I get the feeling that the ABS reactions they'll last a little bit longer than the fury around the tornado bats this time last year. I think that's what we talked about on the first Monday after the opening weekend, or the torpedo bats rather. I think ABS will still be drawing some oohs and ahs all the way through the season. The torpedo bats quickly forgotten a year ago, even though they were still in use. They just weren't the same rage that they were after that first series. The other big news that went down since we last spoke was the details came out on Nico Hoerner's extension with the Cubs. He got a 6-year, $141 million deal. There's some deferrals in there, so present day value is a bit less than that. But this gives the Cubs an increasing core, right? If you look at the longer-term contracts they've signed, they have Dansby Swanson through 2029, Alex Bregman through 2030, Nico Hoerner through 2032, Pete Crow Armstrong through 2032. And then they have some non-extended players with several years of club control, like Edward Cabrera through 2028, Michael Busch through 2029, Cade Horton through 2030, Daniel Palencia through 2030, and if you want to consider them core guys, Matt Shaw through 2031, and Moises Ballesteros through 2023, maybe stretching it a little bit on one or both of those last two. But you're starting to see some bigger, longer-term commitments for this group. And I'm curious about Hoerner in particular, because his profile is not often one that gets paid quite like this, right? Over $20 million a year for a guy that just doesn't have a lot of in-game power. Nico Hoerner has a good hit tool, plays great defense at second base. He's got speed. How do you think he's going to age, and how surprised were you that the Cubs made this commitment now with Hoerner on the brink of reaching free agency this winter?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was some tremendous fan pressure. He's a favorite, and people feel that he's a huge part of this team. There's also just the precedent that the Cubs have set now with locking up Pete Crow Armstrong and having, a core that is under contract for 5-6 years now. And then if you pair Nico Hoerner with Pete Crow Armstrong, that's kind of a fun pairing to have under control for a while, because they're both really excellent at defense, and then their skills kind of complement each other. Where Pete Armstrong's going to swing and miss, but he's going to hit for a lot of power. Nico Hoerner's not going to swing and miss. So interesting to have these two guys locked up. Maybe they even think that Nico Hoerner could play shortstop for them at some point, but I do think there's a little bit of risk here. And that risk is that even for this year, not all of Nico Hoerner's projections are for him to be an above-average bat. This is what happens when you don't hit for a lot of power, is that your ceiling is lowered. So far, Nico Hoerner is only 3% better than league average with the bat overall, even though he has a 282 average. It's just because he hasn't hit for power. He only has 36 homers in almost 3,000 plate appearances in the big leagues. And so without that slugging component, you are an on-base machine? Well, not quite. He chases, he's aggressive. He's like a lot of other guys who make a lot of contact in that he is aggressive and tries to put that ball in play. So he doesn't have a great walk rate. His OBP for his career is 339. That's good, but not great. And so what you risk getting near the end of this contract is someone who is, just a glove out there, pretty much. And I don't know, maybe that's fine at the numbers that they've got, and maybe that's fine for a team like this that will supplement Nico Hoerner and Pete Armstrong with other free agents and other players they're developing. They've also, for a little bit of time, had some trouble developing guys in terms of they strike out a lot, the guys they develop, right? And so maybe they're just like, hey, let's just lock in someone who makes control, has a control of the strike zone and makes a lot of contact, and that'll fit with these other guys that we are teaching to, strike out and homer, basically.
Yeah, I think he's a good complement to the core in that way, for sure. I think the value of the defense in the long run could also be a little bit underrated, because if you just look at the time that Nico Hoerner's been in the big leagues, he debuted in 2019 across all positions. He's tied for 17th among position players in defensive runs saved. He's a plus 44, right? So well above average, capable of probably winning more Gold Gloves and being the kind of guy that actually ages really well. And as you said, possibly moves over and plays a little shortstop in a post-Dansby Swanson era several years down the road. But I think what it is it's a sign that the Cubs believe in the core right now and think they can make multiple runs in October with the guys they have there right now, because both middle infielders are locked up, center field covered. You have Bregman at the corner. Maybe eventually Bregman moves over to first or something, but solve that problem later.
Both of these numbers are pretty low. I mean, yes, Pete Armstrong starts to make $30 million a year, but that's in 2031. And in the meantime, you have Swanson at about $26 million a year, Bregman at $35 million a year, Nico Hoerner at 24. These are, to be fair, we have said that we don't love some of the Padres building where they have three big contracts, right? But these three big contracts are not as big as those three big contracts, right? Like, it's just as simple as that. There's enough daylight here to build a team around this. Whereas, if you have three $30 million guys on one team, you chewing up basically $100 million before you build the rest of the team. That's where you can get into trouble. Also, the Cubs should theoretically have more of a financial engine behind them than the San Diego Padres.
Right. I mean, they own their own network, bigger market, lots of factors that are different there. But it's almost like signing a 6-year deal is less risky than signing an 11-year deal.
Right? That too,
That's
right?
Kind of the key. The duration, like the Padres had to stretch that money, the years out to get the money down, and the Cubs can pay the same rate over a shorter number of years and just say it's fine. It might still be a little bit of an overpay, but we're not overpaying him when he's 38 years old. Right? That's kind of huge.
Yeah, I mean, for the next 5 years, they have an excellent defensive third baseman, a shortstop that is still playing excellent defense despite having a weaker arm and being older, and an excellent second baseman. So they've really locked in great, and an excellent center fielder. So they've locked in great defense at key positions, and they're young at catcher. And I don't think that they necessarily, with Miguel Amaya behind Carson Kelly, they've got some youth at catcher. So really, all the most important positions defensively, they've locked down.
I like Amaya, by the way. We haven't talked a lot about him on this show, and I would not be surprised by the end of the season he has a larger share of the workload behind the plate. Carson Kelly was a great story a year ago. I still see him as more of a backup at this stage of his career.
Really a really hot first month that changed everyone's conception of how good Carson Kelly is offensively, I think.
Yeah. One other news-related item to get to, we did see Jacob deGrom get scratched from his scheduled start on Saturday with neck stiffness. It was a few hours before game time when that news came down. It was Jacob Latz who ended up jumping in and making that start in his place. The good news is deGrom was feeling better on Sunday, and they think he could start Tuesday or Wednesday against the Orioles. Just a tough situation in weekly leagues, though, if it locks up before you know for sure. So for now, at least, it looks like deGrom is going to avoid the IL. We'll find out soon if that actually changes for any reason. Coming up, we're going to open up the mailbag and explain how we make our most difficult lineup decisions each week. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Rates and Barrels. We're answering some of your questions. You can join our Discord with the link in the show description and drop questions for future episodes into the mailbag channel. There is one ABS-related question that came in. Ben Johnson wanted to know, do you think ABS challenges will be restricted based on the count? One example that Ben pointed to was Corbin Carroll winning a challenge in an 0-2 count to reverse a strikeout. Is risking the challenge to earn a 1-2 count worth it as opposed to the value added when risking a potential hitter's count going from like a 2-2 to a 3-1? I think this question is also maybe subject to the number of challenges you have left and how early it is in the game, right? If you lose a challenge early and you have one left, let's say you lose a first inning challenge, maybe then the count situation weighs a little more heavily into the calculus as you're kind of deciding whether or not to possibly burn that second one.
Yeah, I think that changes things a lot. And then on top of that, I think we are going to see different teams dial into this differently. Again, the Reds were the best, but they weren't the most aggressive. I believe the Yankees were the most aggressive in the spring. So you're going to have some teams that are more aggressive, and that means that they end up losing their second challenge before the ninth inning. If they continue to be that aggressive. And then you're going to have teams that are going to be really, there was an example of a team being overly passive. The Athletics lost a close game where they didn't use a single challenge. And I think if I was a team, I would tell my catcher, if you have two challenges in the ninth, use them. Like anything borderline that could be a big deal, use them. Now, the opposite is true. Is like, if it's the first inning, you better be right. So I think there's going to be a sliding scale. There's going to be different teams that are differently aggressive. I think there'll be different. I think if you have a lot of trust in your catcher to retain, certain pieces of strategy, I think, yes, you would talk to him about, these are the counts where the count leverage is most important. On a 1-1 count, if it goes to 2-1 and you want it to go to 1-2, and you think it's close, that's the one of the biggest pieces of count leverage right there. The 1-1 to 2-1 or 1-2 is just an amazing amount of leverage, and so I think that would be the count that might be prioritized the most in terms of early game. Of course, late game, the counts that prioritized the most are just strikeouts or walks. That's just like the final number, the final pitch. And so, I think there'll be different ways to do it. But I think that early in the game, I would prioritize something like 1-1 counts, and I would want them to be like 99% sure, early in the game, because I want to keep that challenge. I want to use it again.
I think we're going to see a reasonable distribution, though, of strategies that are utilized over the course of the season because of where teams are at in terms of overall development and where teams are at in terms of who they actually have behind the plate. Like you might trust veteran catchers a lot more than young catchers. You might trust your catcher all the time if you got a young pitching staff. I felt like Edgar Caro was challenging a ton of calls over the course of the series between the Brewers and the White Sox, and they need every ounce of help they can get, right? So, there's also like aggression in some cases might be lower stakes because You're in a rebuilding year, so you're just trying to put out some fires early in the game sometimes.
Yeah, and like, what if you were like the Marlins and you wanted to take away game calling from your catchers, and you're not showing a lot of trust in that? How much trust are then you're going to give the catcher when it comes to this? So, yeah, a lot going on there, and I would have to assume that some of the framing skills that everyone was so like sort of hand-wringy over, like what will happen to the framing skills? I think, in this system at least, you're still valuing framing skills. It's basically framing. You expect Patrick Bailey to be good at this.
It's still going to matter too if you lose your challenges, because in that case, then the zone is whatever the umpire's calling, right? If you have no challenges left, then framing's still going to be really important.
Yeah, that's a good point too.
Thanks for that question, Ben. Another question here from Madigan. This is directed directly to Eno. Could you share how Stuff Plus data gets integrated into FanGraphs and when previous day data is normally available? And is arm angle info still running or updating once a week? Would love to hear more about that process.
Yeah, so now arm angle is run nightly, so that's really good news. That happened after Matt Denowitz and I gave a presentation on imputing arm angle because they weren't doing it nightly. So now arm angle is in there nightly, and there's really no concern with that. In terms of when it's up, sometimes there's a StatCast, needle in the haystack, some problem that, causes it to delay a little bit, or sometimes there's a refresh. I do believe that when I'm looking by, 9 a.m. Pacific time, that I'm looking at the next day numbers. One easy way you can do it is on FanGraphs, you can have a leaderboard that says yesterday as a split. And you can just have yesterday's Stuff Plus up as a split on the Stuff Plus leaderboards over at FanGraphs. So you can start to see when those populate. But I do believe by morning Pacific time, they should be in there.
You could even bookmark the yesterday board and then just hit it, and then you'll know first thing, right?
Yeah.
Bookmark, or just open a tab and leave it open. That's what Eno would do.
But yeah, now that we're in the regular season, we're getting arm angle every morning, and that's the benefit of waiting too, because if you produce one of these cards that you see, that's like Stuff Plus right after the game, first of all, there's a lot of stats that haven't been washed, and sometimes they'll actually change stats and change numbers once they kind of see some errors or whatever it is. StatCast washes the data, overnight. And then the other thing is you won't have arm angle because they don't have arm angle. So especially for debuts and stuff, waiting till the next day, because arm angle is a hugely important part of Stuff Plus. It was a huge feature, added predictive quality when we added it, just because hitters are looking at that arm angle for an expectation of movement, and a lot of stuff is upsetting that expectation of movement.
There you go. I just frantically had to search Jake Irvin on FanGraphs to see what his stuff numbers looked like, because I used a report card to pick him up in a really deep league, and it turns out, the stuff actually is a lot better for Jake Irvin. So I was right to be quick. The challenge has been upheld.
Yeah, look at that. 112 Stuff Plus. I mean, part of it is just velo being up, but he's got some shape different changes and some mix changes. This is why veteran pitchers are so exciting, is that, they've shown the aptitude to add a certain amount of pitches, and then, they can just tweak one of them and the whole arsenal can come together. For example, just Jake Irvin throwing his cutter 3 times more often this year might be enough to be like, oh, now they can't hone in on any one of his fastballs because he's basically 30-30-30 across his fastballs. I hate to use him too often, but there's a sort of a Chad Patrick vibe on this one with all the fastballs, basically. Jake Irvin. Another big Stuff Plus increaser over the spring that held it was Emerson Hancock. 99 Stuff Plus is not amazing, but it is way better than he ever had before, and he's always been a guy who has good command. So now the cutter and the four seam give him 2 pitches, 2 hard pitches. He's always had a great slider. People are like, well, he only have him at 128. I have him maybe around 105 now in the rankings, and there's a couple reasons, which is, it's still only 99 stuff plus. He was at home, and we've seen hot starts from him in the past. And then lastly, Bryce Miller, though he's out for a month, he's only out for a month. So I don't know how hard to push a guy in the rankings when you may only still get 70 innings out of him for the season.
I think despite the opening series heroics of Chase DeLauder, 4 homers over 4 games, and just thinking about that supporting cast around him, it's still a lineup you're picking on a lot, matchup wise. Like the Guardians, like you're not fearing them, you're actually seeking them out. And I think being in T-Mobile Park, especially, that was a perfect situation for Hancock. I see generally a home streamer right there, despite how good he looked, right? Like that's the general takeaway I would have. I would not say, oh yeah, pick him up in 10-team leagues and plan on using him all the time. I don't think that's where we're headed with Emerson Hancock, even though it was a great outing for him on Sunday night.
Let's put him up against another Stuff Plus surger, Randy Vásquez. We saw that he was surging in spring, and he kept it in his first Major League regular season start. Again, though, 100 Stuff Plus. It's a guy that basically has a bunch of average pitches and no real standout out pitch that would make him an ace. I know he's got a 35% strikeout rate, and I know he's throwing 95 now instead of 93.5, but it is still kind of a kitchen sink with 100 Stuff Plus and hit or miss walk rates, hit or miss location rates. So is Randy Vásquez about the same in your estimation?
Pretty similar. And I do think, matchup dependency is going to be a big factor for me here as well. I do think with Vásquez, we've seen him pop in the model at various points in the past, right? Like this isn't the first time that he's been like good enough in the model to be a starter and it had these like weirdly confounding results. Like I'm trying to decide if anything has changed enough for me to say anything different than what I said about Hancock. I think you can probably get away with using Randy Vásquez for most of his home starts. I would be watching very carefully in these next couple starts to see if that swinging strike rate stays anywhere close to the improvement we saw first time out. I mean, this is a guy that usually lives in the 7 to 8% range in swinging strike rate. He was at 14.3% in his first start of the year. And if I remember correctly, we did see some glimpses of this during spring training too. So this isn't completely out of nowhere, but the magnitude of the improvement, like the results were so good the first time out. That's the part where I'm saying, yeah, okay, like, is this like a league average starter now? Because even that would be fine if it came with a better strikeout rate. Because even when the ratios have been good from Randy Vásquez, last year, 78 Ks in 133 and 2/3 innings. That is very hard to use in most leagues.
And Hancock has the same shortcoming. And one thing that you have to be careful with Stuff Plus is that Stuff Plus, when we put it into projection systems, it most affected balls in play, batting average on balls in play, BABIP. It most affected home run rates. It most affected balls in play numbers because we have a pretty decent sense. Like if you strike out people in the past, you're going to strike out people in the future. So one of the best ways to predict future strikeout rate is just past strikeout rate, right? And for both these guys, they've had poor strikeout rates in the past. For Hancock, in some ways, it's even a little bit dodgier because he only had a 7% swing strike rate. He only had a 19% called strike and whiff rate. And good number there is 30%. And somehow he struck out nearly half the guys he saw. So there's a bit of luck in terms of maybe when you get the whiff, and what count leverages you got. I hesitate to say either of these guys will even have a league average strikeout rate this year. So that's why, I tend to be, I'm aggressive when there's a huge stuff number and a huge strikeout rate, and there's some scouting pedigree. With guys who pop like this, who've established a low strikeout rate in the big leagues and have a little bit of a Stuff Plus bump, I'm gonna be a little bit more cautious. I guess I'll put Vásquez ahead of Hancock just for the fact that Vásquez might be able to have this job all year. Whereas Hancock might be doing this. You might find 2 good weeks that you want to start Hancock before Bryce Miller is back.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think Irvin actually is in the same tier for me. If you go back to 2024, he had a 120 whip. Each of the last 2 seasons, he's tossed 180 plus innings. We know from our Mackenzie Gore analysis and just looking at this Nats defense the last couple of years, the defense has been awful. The one highlight that keeps replaying in my head from the Nats defensively over the weekend was Nasim Nunez colliding in left field with Dalen Lyle. And C.J. Abrams wasn't there that day. He was away for a personal matter. He was back on Sunday. So part of that was just Nunez maybe being relatively new to that situation. But I don't know if the defense, despite all the changes in that staff and all the positive momentum we have around the Nats organization right now, I don't know if the defense necessarily gets fixed quickly. So I would say that's the other thing that would separate some guys like this. Is you might say, man, the Nats have the worst defense of those 3 teams. So if they're all going to be lower than you'd like in K rate, more balls in play might be more problematic for Irvin than it is for Hancock or for Vásquez.
Yeah, the big change for Jake Irvin, now that I'm looking, is just the cutter has a brand new shape, and he's upped it to 14%. The slider has a new shape too, and so new breaking balls, new lease on life, I guess.
Right. I almost think he's changed the most stuff-wise of the 3. So if you're playing the absolute stuff game, maybe that's the way you want to go. But if you're just thinking about how they fit into their respective rotations, I think you're getting a little from column A and a little from column B by taking the chance on Randy Vásquez right now. Last mailbag question here comes from Sweet J. I've heard you guys mention A and B bullpens more lately. Can you talk more in depth about that and give an example of the players that be part of A and B bullpens? I think the Brewers are the example I've heard a couple of times as having a good A and B, as well as a manager that uses them appropriately. Is usage of them as important as just having good ones?
So I think this is coming from a team standpoint rather than a fantasy standpoint. And so I think it's just a question of could you outperform your entire bullpen stats if you had 3 really good ones that you were very smart about using and you won every game where you used them, right? And I think that is true. I don't know. Usually, though, when you look at it, bad bullpens don't have 3 great relievers in them. So I'm trying to look at the bottom of the bullpen list to try and be like, oh, this team could outperform maybe a team like the Giants with Ryan Walker, Eric Miller, and Caleb Killian or Joel Peguero or somebody. Maybe they will actually find 3 really good relievers that can win them their A games. And then in the other games they're playing, and I'm just picking on Jose Butto for no reason, but he's not as good, and so he'll soak up other innings, and maybe that's a team. It hasn't been going well for Riley O'Brien Riley O'Brien himself is doing okay, but the Cardinals bullpen, Matt Swanson doesn't look as good as we thought, but maybe Stanek, Romero, and O'Brien is just enough to outperform their overall numbers. So those are teams that I might think the Reds, I think are a perennial example of this. Actually, the Reds don't have the money, and they don't have necessarily, they've been holding on to their starting pitching prospects and not putting them in the bullpen. So Connor Phillips, it took him a long time to get to the bullpen. He could be a really good bullpen piece for them. But right now, I'd say their 3 best relievers are Emilio Pagan, Tony Santillan, and Graham Ashcraft. And I think they lack some depth. Maybe Sam Moll's all right. Maybe Connor Phillips is all right. But I think they lack depth. But maybe that's just good enough to win them the games they need to win.
Yeah, I think as far as that second question goes, is usage of them as important as just having good ones? I mean, it's on a similar level because I think overuse becomes a factor over the course of the season. Avoiding back-to-back, some of the things that make relievers less effective in a series. Like there are some managers that seem to do better at that than others. I think that does factor into maximizing the value of a pen overall. Just pulling the right levers and not putting your guys in those spots where they're more likely to fail. So I guess, I think it's as important or almost as important. If you said, what's more important, the depth or the person making the decisions, the depth probably matters more because it can dummy-proof some of the decisions a little bit.
Yeah. It also gives you a chance to make a make a game where you're not going to use your A bullpen, get it into that, right? Like a comeback, right? So, for example, the Cubs, I think, are actually maybe the best example here, where like Palencia, Maton, and Harvey are really good, I think. I don't know about their depth, but there's one piece in their depth that could be really important. That's Ben Brown. With a new sinker in the bullpen, the way they're using him, he could be the guy who comes in when you're down a run.
Yes, keeping the game close. Keep it within
and
reach.
And then you can get to the A. So, yeah, that's, depth is always going to be important at some point, and that's just an example of how you could use questionable depth, but one really important person, because Ben Brown should also be able to throw like 80 innings this year, given his stature as a former starting pitcher.
Yeah, I think Ben Brown's going to be a great bullpen weapon for the Cubs this year. I'd be very surprised if Craig Counsell doesn't use him in a very effective manner throughout the summer. We need to take one more break. When we come back, we dig into a key question. How do we make our most difficult lineup decisions? We've got to make them every single Monday. We'll break it down when we come back. Welcome back to Rates and Barrels. We are talking about how we make our most difficult lineup decisions. Eno, let's use a specific example as you sit here on Monday before the games get underway. What's troubling you within your lineups?
Well, I do use the Razzball tool that has weekly projections. I think that is a really great way to sum up all the different effects, because you want to somehow account for the parks that they're going to see. You want to account for the pitchers they're going to see. They want to account for the handedness of the pitchers you want to see. They want to account for the quality. It's something that kind of takes a model to kind of add it all up, because otherwise you're just going to end up using something that doesn't really matter, like batter versus pitcher or something like that. And so what you really need to do is, maybe create your own model or use the Razzball model. In failing that, I think that one of the easiest things to do is, if you have, like an Evan Carter, and you'll maybe talked about that, but I have a lot of Evan Carter, Josh Lowe. I have these like guys, if they're projected to be maybe 10% better than league average or so, you don't want them facing same-handed guys. So for your guys that were your fifth outfielders and your sixth outfielders and your utility guys, you want, like, if they're going to face a lefty, that's only 2 games out of 3 that they're going to play, then you'd rather have the guy who plays 3 games, and will play all 3. So that's an easy one. But sometimes you'll use these tools and you'll still get to near ties. I have Brooks Lee versus Kobe Mayo, and for one spot in one league, and I have to remember, if you did the tracker thing where you tracked your team, going through the draft, you might remember that, I had a little deficiency here, or I had a deficiency there. I remember on this league, and this team in particular, that I was about sort of 7 to 10 homers shy of my target. So given the choice between Brooks Lee and Kobe Mayo, I'm going to default to Kobe Mayo, because this is the team that needs a little bit of power. Then another one where I have Cam Smith versus Parker Meadows versus Victor Scott. All of them are within 15 ranks of each other by Razzball, and I have one slot for all of them. I would love to go to Cam Smith and say, just take the guy you think has the most upside that could go nuts. But Cam Smith gets Ranger Suarez, Brian Bayo with his new curveball, and Garrett Crochet. So I'm going to go with Parker Meadows, because I'm not as afraid about his pitching matchups. So I guess I generally say handedness, matchups, parks. Those are the 3 most important things for me in order.
I would also throw lineup position in there, and I realize some of the smaller projections are going to have those in and some aren't. Weather could actually be a consideration. Bullpen quality and recent usage, if that's not incorporated. Like, you're starting to look for those other secondary factors that matter. So when you were talking about the schedules for, I think, the first hitter toss-up you had, I started immediately looking. I'm like, well, who are they playing, right? Brooks Lee has the Royals. Like, that's kind of interesting to me, because the Royals bullpen looks like it's a problem, even beyond Carlos Estevez, whose velo is still down.
This one's harder for me.
Several ticks.
Yeah.
And he got hit by a comebacker in the ankle. There's all these other things that you want to start factoring in. It's like, I start to think a little bit more like I'm building a DFS lineup when I'm starting to make these very tough marginal sorts of decisions. And I think that's one area where you want to say, okay, like whose bullpen's better, the Rangers bullpen or the Royals bullpen? If you're comparing a Twins hitter facing the Royals against the Jays hitter against the Rangers, for example, like those things obviously matter as well. And then, micro playing time trends. Even this caught my eye on Sunday. Brooks Lee did not start on Sunday. Tristan Gray did. In the 2 games that Brooks Lee started, he hit 9th. So he's not necessarily an everyday guy, even though he switch hits. And right now, he's buried at the absolute bottom of the Twins lineup. So that makes him pretty fringy for me.
That also gives you a sense of how the team values him.
Yeah.
They, as a batter, they do not value him very highly. So maybe you shouldn't. Sometimes you can use the teams as a proxy for your own analysis,
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do that. I think the toughest decision overall for me is in one of my NFBC leagues. I think it was a Draft Champions League. And right now, we're at the point in the year where it's just like, who are my best healthy pitchers? If I have 9 starters in a week, great, I'll use 9 starters. If I have 4 relievers I got to play because my starters are banged up, that's fine. I'll just play the best pitchers, and then over the course of the year, I'll start to toggle that balance a little bit more. So I'm in a situation where I'm starter heavy. I'm comfortable going either way. And the choice I have to make is actually Chris Paddock, who begins the week with a start against the White Sox, and I believe should get a second start at the end of the week if the schedule holds up. Yeah, he'll face the Yankees in a difficult road matchup the second time out. Or Brian Baker, who's part of the reliever cluster F right now, where we're just looking for anyone and everyone that might get us saves. And my thought was, a 2-step like Paddock's scares me for someone with that skill set. If there's someone else that's generally in, like I'll absorb the bad start to get the good one. For Paddock, I don't think I can do it, given my brain and how it's wired to think about Paddock as a liability.
Like he might not even get that second start.
Well, and in this case, not getting the second start might be okay. So
Yeah.
You'd be more inclined to say, some weird stuff might happen with the schedule, or they want to throw a 6th starter in there. Like stuff could happen between Monday and Sunday.
Yeah, I also think that, in shallower leagues, like, a really difficult one might be something where, like, let's say you have Emmett Sheehan, this week, and you're going up against, let's say, Emerson Hancock or Randy Vásquez, one of your hot new starters that you picked up. And you liked Emmett Sheehan in your draft, and that's why you took him. But Emmett Sheehan, was 92 miles an hour again in his final inning. And he's in a hitter's park in Washington, but normally you would say, oh, I love that. I'm going to start Emmett Sheehan in Washington, versus, like Randy Vásquez at Boston, or like, which is not a great matchup for him, and Emerson Hancock, in Anaheim, which is a pretty good one. Like, would you ever consider starting Emerson Hancock over Emmett Sheehan this week, just based on a little stuff thing you noticed, or the declining velo, and to be honest, like the results in the first outing,
It's hard to ignore the results, but you do want to look more at those underlying numbers. And I do think when you see velo concerns with Sheehan, that adds another layer to the problem and makes it more difficult. I think I'd still end up using Sheehan over Hancock in that situation, but that gap got a lot smaller for all of those reasons. I have the same thing happening on the hitter side right now. You mentioned Evan Carter before. I've got Evan Carter all over the place. We've talked about that throughout the spring. And for my last outfield spot, I'm looking at Carter versus Owen Casey. Key difference here, 3 righties on the schedule for Owen Casey, only 2 in the first part of the week out of 3 games for Carter, so you think there's a possibility of him at least sitting one of those games or getting buried in the order. Casey started 2 of 3 over the weekend, and that was against 2 left-handed starters, right? So factoring in like an expected 3 starts, quality of opponent very low. It's the back end of the White Sox rotation and that White Sox bullpen. Those are all good things. I'm playing Owen Casey over Carter this week, even though macro view, like whole season, I think Evan Carter is going to do really well. More often than not, Evan Carter is going to be in my lineup, and I think he's probably the slightly more valuable player over the course of the year.
Yeah, it is hard to draft someone, be excited about him, have a lot of shares, and then remember, nope, still got to sit him these certain times, and that was baked into the price. That's why I got him where I got him. That's why I have a lot of shares, is he was cheap, and I have to also sit him against lefties. I think that's true of a lot of those guys. The Carter, Lowe, that whole package that I was talking about earlier is definitely something that was why they were cheap. And, sometimes you might be lured into, like, Josh Lowe, like, had a pretty good beginning of the season so far. I mean, not in terms of batting average, but he has a homer, and like, let's say I don't know if there's somebody else that's like sort of in this group that's just had a great start. You'd be like,
Trout. Trout's validated all of your positivity.
Yeah,
about him.
but Trout is a right-hander.
You'd probably play him anyway.
Yeah, I'm just trying to say in that crew, like, let's say just Carter had like a 300 average right now. You'd still kind of want to be like, I'm going to sit him against lefties. That was the point. That's why I got him.
Yeah, you got to hold on to some of those priors for a little while before things actually start to change in season. We usually spend the last part of our show on Mondays talking about where the money went. It just means, like, who'd we pick up, who'd we cut. I'm calling it pickups and panics, and it's pretty abbreviated this week because A, it was a short partial week, and B, for the most part, I don't think we had any must-get players pop up on the wire. What it really was the bullpen mess for a lot of clubs reared its ugly head over the course of the first series. I think the most expensive player picked up in my main event league was Cole Sands at 111 out of 1,000, right? Which is fine. It's not 350 or 400. It could end up being a really nice play, especially if he even holds the job for 6 or 8 weeks. But I think the first question I have for you is, out of the mess of relievers, Sands, Ryan Stanek, Brian Baker, Lucas Erceg, Matt Strom, like, who actually was worth picking up this weekend, or is still worth picking up if you're in a first come, first serve league and are thinking about taking a shot in a bullpen somewhere?
I think what I want is, like, if I had my druthers, I would want a pitcher who obviously had the best stuff, of the opportunity. Like, if I wanted a new closer, I wanted him to have the best stuff in his bullpen. I'd want him to be used as either a closer or a setup man, when I was picking him up. And I would want this to be more of a long-term situation. The reason I bring that up is that, there's a lot of consternation about Brian Abreu's fastball velocity this last weekend, and that it's down. He's 93. Stuffless still thought he was all right. He still has great shape on his pitches. But then there's also the fact that Josh Hader could be back in a couple weeks, And so I kind of feel like that one has maybe a limited time to be that relevant. So, do I like that AJ Bluebaugh is sitting 97 and looks like he has great stuff? Yeah. Do I think Brian King could, do a decent job for a little bit if Abreu is hurt? Yeah. Do I think Abreu himself could maybe do it for 2 weeks before Hader comes back? Yeah. But generally, I think Hader comes back. So that makes that less appealing. The bullpens that do fit what I'm talking about, I think best are Kansas City. Maybe, in terms of long-term, Minnesota. I think St. Louis could also, they could produce a guy who's there all year. Anaheim is interesting. Do you think that's a all-year thing, or do you think when Ben Joyce comes back, he just takes over?
I keep thinking Joyce is the guy when he comes back. It's just hard to say he's back soon and he's himself. And I think even with Ben Joyce, for as hard as he throws, the strikeouts haven't really been anywhere near the level we'd expect. Like, he gets swings and misses, but he doesn't get a lot of Ks. So I don't know if that's like betting on future growth in that area. The health complications, I think, are also on my mind here too. And they have other guys that are kind of low-key interesting. I mean, they sent Walbert Urania down, but I imagine there's a name that's popping for you in that Anaheim pen right now.
I love Ryan Zefferjon. I think Sam Bachman is interesting. In fact, I did not do any big bids for any relievers this weekend because I just felt like I can pick apart flaws in each of these situations. I just tried to give you the ones where I think there are long-term viability. Lucas Erceg, though, does not have great stuff plus. Matt Strom, the lefty, has better stuff plus, but he's the lefty. So, what's going to happen there? Is Urseg just going to get 60% of the opportunities going forward, or is he going to blow it and hand it to somebody else later? I didn't think that was one where I just needed to put down a bunch of cash and take him. Cole Sands has a sub 100 stuff plus. By stuff plus, Cody Funderburk should be maybe the closer there, but he's also like a sinker sweeper mid 90s guy. So I think that one might be ugly all year. Honestly, I don't know that I have someone I'm super excited about coming out of there. And then in St. Louis, I think there's in fact 3 contenders that are all about equally good, which is Ryan Stanek, Riley O'Brien, and Jojo Romero. And so I guess it's Stanek, but I don't have that much confidence in him. It's 108 stuff plus is just slightly above average for a starter and for a reliever. And we also saw that he's capable of blowing games. I mean, he did. So, and then the Tampa one seems like a big mess, but I did want to show people my dashboard so that they could understand how I'm going into this. So this is the Angels pen, and it's got all the numbers that I've got that I look at when I'm looking at relievers. And so I have saves, holds. The holds give you a good look into who's pitching the ninth, who's pitching tight games, and that's usage. Usage is just as important as anything else. Stuff, strikeout rate, velocity, anything else. Usage is probably the most important thing because that's the manager telling you, oh, I trust this guy to hold this game for me. So holds is good. I have shutdowns and meltdowns in there. Then I have K percentage, walk percentage. Sierra is a good ERA estimator. It's one of the best. The next one is leverage index. I have game leverage index. That tells you how tight was the game when the player was put in. Chase Siltith actually has the number 1 game leverage index for them. Drew Pomerantz, number 2. Urena's not there anymore. Bachman has been in games at a slightly higher leverage than Zephyr John. And then Romano's actually gotten the easiest chances so far. And then I have the various stuff. I have stuff for the fastballs on there because I want to see if they're a four-seam guy or a sinker guy and if they have good stuff. But what also makes this tough in the Angels pen is that Romano has a 107 stuff plus, Zephyr John 119, Bachman 106, Pomerantz 110, Silthith 110. So they actually have a lot of guys it could be. They have 4 holds. Silthith, Pomerantz, Urena, and Bachman have holds. So I guess it's Zephyr John is not in the front seat, but I have a couple shares in really deep leagues because I just think he's a good pitcher. Pomerantz is a lefty, and you have to know who the lefty is. So I would say that Romano's slightly safe for now, but not all that safe. And if you're talking about safety of who's in the first seat, who's the safest you think between Urseg, if he is in the first seat, we don't even know yet, Cole Sands, Brian Abreu, Jordan Romano, who's the safest number 1 there?
I'd still have Brian Abreu a notch ahead.
Yeah.
If it's a mechanical issue that gets cleaned up, he goes back to being a notch above all those other names that we're talking about as the current first chairs. But
he's also maybe a short-term guy, I'm tempted to say maybe I like Urseg the best.
Yeah, and Urseg, it's still a 99 stuff plus coming back this year. That's not great.
And it's all down after surgery. He had an injury, and then it hasn't been the same since.
Yeah, I'm worried about that, and I was pretty optimistic about Lucas Urseg. I held Matt Swanson for what it's worth. I think the Cardinals are just a mess in the bullpen right now, and it was one really bad day. It might be enough to cost them opportunities for a long time, but I wanted to see one more week before I could move on, which is maybe a mistake on my part, but I just think it speaks to how unsettled everything is. Did you cut anybody that you're genuinely worried about letting go, like the FOMO cut of the week? Did you have anyone?
Oh, by the way, I just want to say maybe Brian Baker's the best out of all of these. Baker has great stuff numbers. Jax has been really, has blown 2 games. And so, I would say that Baker and Jax are competing basically for that role, and Jax really needs to do something better next time out. So Baker might just have it.
Just needs to get away from home run issues. I think that's where a lot of the ERA bloat has come from the last 2 seasons for Brian Baker. But yeah, FOMO cut for the week. Did you have one?
I do. The only hitter I cut in all of my leagues, and I'm sure this one will come back to bite me, and I'm getting pre-angry about it. But I cut Jordan Lawler in one of my leagues because he's not an outfielder yet. I needed to have an outfielder. I had 4 or 5. I had like 5 outfielders, and I needed like a 6th outfielder for whatever reason. And so I picked up Nathan Church, and I dropped Jordan Lawler. And that some of that was short term, just being like, I need to have an outfielder this week, and I need to have Church, and who's my dropper? I guess it's Lawler. The other part of it was reading Andrea Arcadipane's piece in The Athletic about Jordan Lawler and Jack Caglianone's spring standouts, and she loves the swing decision changes that Jack Caglianone made. As do we here. But when it came to talking about Jordan Lawler, she brought up something that has been scratching my head about a little bit, which is his ability to make contact. And she said, looking at his mechanics, it does not appear that he has worked on any changes to his stance, load, or swing that would encourage increased contact. So she was looking at him like wondering if he's going to make more contact. And there is something there because Jordan Lawler's had a 13.9% swing strike rate so far this year. I know it's a really small sample, but that is over pitches and swings versus plate appearances. So, and that also fits in line with Jordan Lawler's previous swing strike rate numbers. So he actually, in the major leagues, has a 35% strikeout rate with a 13.6% swing strike rate. It's only 115 plate appearances, but now that's a little bit more than 0. That's not just a weekend. And I'm just worried that the amount of strikeouts, the amount of swing and miss that he has, does not fit the power that he has. If he had a 30% strikeout rate and also was going to slug 500, then that would be fine. So there's something there that's missing for me. And with the short-term need, I just decided that I would move on. He also wasn't somebody I drafted very high. So it was just like, it was like, oh, maybe he'll just tear down the house and I'll wait till he's an outfielder. But he didn't do that, and so I'm moving on. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I mean, it's always troubling to cut someone that has the prospect pedigree of Jordan Lawler, especially. He started 2 or 3 games in that opening series against the Dodgers. They did play Jorge Barroso over him in left field for the finale, so it's not like he had
was that for a
perfect
lefty?
Run of the weekend. I think that was all righties that they played. Church started 2 of 3 also, for what it's worth. So similar opening series usage. Yeah, those were all righties that the Diamondbacks faced in that series.
But
so
I think Church
really
faced the lefty. I think he sat against one lefty.
Church sat against the lefty. So maybe you got big side platoon versus mostly every day for now. Either way, I understand why you're worried. It probably won't bite you quickly. If it bites you, it's going to be like second half, maybe a little bit longer, even though. And I'm a Jordan Lawler believer. It just might take a little bit of time before it all clicks for him.
If my bench clears up and I have a room for a stash again, like what it was he was in a place where I needed something and it couldn't be a stash, right? Because I already had some early injuries and some stuff. Like if I can clear up space for a stash, Lawler is back on the stash list. It just wasn't somebody I needed to plug in, and I didn't have even a place to plug him in because of his position.
You've defended yourself well.
I knew you'd be angry.
3 homers incoming this week from Jordan Lawler, right? We'll get into some more specifics of things that have us nervous probably on our show on Tuesday. We also have our Giants preview coming up with Andrew Baggerly a couple days after the start of the season, but they had a disappointing first series against the Yankees. We'll see how things go in their series opener in San Diego on Monday night. So that's going to do it for this episode of Rates and Barrels. We're back with you on Tuesday.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for tuning in. Make sure to hit that subscribe or follow button so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed it, drop us a like, leave a rating, or sound off in the comments. We'll see you next time.